Hi, everyone. Welcome back. We're going to talk about simple reinforcement schedules. So, now that you know unconditioned and conditioned reinforcers, this is a way to deliver reinforcement on a schedule. There's 4 simple schedules. The more complex schedules are much more complex, unfortunately. I am going to lecture briefly on the complex reinforcement schedules, just 2 of them, so you can understand the difference and know how these simple schedules can all be combined into things that deliver very complex schedules. These 4 you do need to know. This is some of the more mathematical stuff within this whole course. I think we talked about ways to bring all the data together. That was very mathematical too. This is very mathematical in that way. First, we're going to define each simple schedule. So understand the key characteristics of fixed ratio, variable ratio, fixed interval, and variable interval schedules. We're going to talk about the key differences between ratio and interval schedules. One is based on how many responses a person gives, and the other is a time schedule. Recognize the patterns of responding associated with each one. Each one has these specific ways people respond. And then we're going to apply these schedules in real world examples. So we'll think about some everyday clinical examples to show how these work. What are simple schedules? They're when reinforcement is delivered. So how many times does a person have to respond before you give them reinforcement? How long has to occur before you give them reinforcement? Which schedule you use will affect the rate and pattern of the behavior. So how much behavior the individual engages in, how frequently and consistently behavior occurs. We have 2 main dimensions and we kind of mix them all together. So ratio versus interval and fixed versus variable. This also is how we fade. You might start with a really dense schedule of reinforcement where they get a lot of reinforcement really early on. And then so every response they get reinforcement, and then you'll slowly fade that away. When we talk about fading reinforcement, that's essentially what we are doing. We are making the schedule less dense, is what we say. So a dense schedule is they get lots of reinforcement, and less dense means they're going to have to respond more or more time passes to get the reinforcement. First, we're going to talk about continuous reinforcement. This is known as fixed ratio 1, and we'll talk about fixed ratio 1 in a moment. It's this schedule, continuous reinforcement, is a schedule in which the occurrence of a target behavior is reinforced every single time the target behavior occurs. And the kind of key features of this is reinforcement occurs after every response. It's what we use when we're teaching new behaviors. Discrete trial training is fixed ratio or continuous reinforcement. It allows the person to build rapid acquisition of the skills, and it's highly sensitive to extinction. So if you stop reinforcing, the behavior will diminish without fading. Every time a child says, please, they receive a sticker is an example of continuous reinforcement. What it means is every single response, the person is going to receive reinforcement for that response. And so I'll talk a little about extinction. Fixed ratio 1 or continuous reinforcement schedules are very sensitive to extinction because every single time they've received reinforcement in the past. So the second it goes away, they're like, well, why am I doing this? I'll just stop. Now, when you use a less dense schedule where they didn't receive the reinforcement every single time, they don't know if this is just part of their schedule, not receiving this time, and they'll receive it later on, so they continue to engage in the behavior. Those are less resistant to extinction. Extinction is removing the reinforcement from the situation. When they engage in the behavior, they don't get reinforcement anymore. Why this is important, it's important for multiple reasons. One, when you're building interventions, but also when you want to use extinction. So if they've tantrumed and received attention every single time for that tantrum, that would be a better behavior to put on extinction, though I don't really promote. We'll talk about the ethics of extinction. I think there's easier ways to do that, but just for the example. that would be easy to extinguish that behavior because it's receiving reinforcement every single time. Now, if they tantrum and they maybe get the attention every few times, like the person doesn't always attend to the tantrum, that's going to be harder to use extinction on, to remove the attention. And we'll talk about that in the extinction lecture. Examples of continuous reinforcement: a dog receives a treat every time it sits on command. And again, if you stop giving it the treat, it's going to stop sitting. Or more likely to. Nothing always happens perfectly. A vending machine dispenses a snack every time money is inserted. And this one's a perfect one to think about that extinction, those extinction ideas. So if this vending machine is broken, you put in money and you do not get a snack, and maybe you try one more time, put in money to get the snack, and it doesn't. Most people would not do it the third time. See, so it's very easy to extinguish that behavior. A teacher praises a student every time they raise their hand. A student gets a point for a correct flashcard answer. So every single time these people engage in the behavior, they get reinforcement. And all these schedules develop our interventions, but you can also utilize them to explain behavior. You can see behavior in the world and go, oh, this behavior is on this schedule, so it would be resistant to extinction or not resistant to extinction. This is why the behavior is at this rate right now, because it's been on this schedule. The environment, the teacher, the parent, someone put it on that schedule, just not even knowing they're providing reinforcement on that schedule. CRF or FR1 is teaching new skills or behaviors, strengthening weak or inconsistent behaviors, and shaping successive approximations. That's how we do shaping with an FR1 or CRF. I call them fixed ratio when I don't say continuous reinforcement. They mean the exact same thing. Intermittent reinforcements. Everything else is intermittent. It means is that not all instances of a behavior is reinforced, but some are. Reinforcement is not delivered after every response. It builds resistance to extinction. It's used to maintain behaviors that have already been learned and produces slower acquisition but more stable long-term performance. Over time, any other schedule falls under intermittent reinforcement. We're going to talk about 4. And then we'll talk about kind of complex schedules next video. But everything else is intermittent reinforcement, which is much more resistant to extinction for those reasons I just told you. Fixed ratio is just its own thing. Fixed ratio 1 is continuous reinforcement, and then anything else fixed ratio would be intermittent reinforcement. The fixed means it's a fixed amount of responses. Ratio means response. For a certain amount of responses, and this never changes, they get a reinforcement after a certain number of responses. So reinforcement is delivered after the set number of responses. So if FR1 is that continuous, but FR5, you would reinforce every 5th response. So they engage in the behavior 5 times and they get reinforcement after the 5th time. This creates a very high rate with a brief post-reinforcement pause right after they get reinforcement. So the bigger it is, the more that post-reinforcement pause. They start understanding the schedule. Any person, any animal that you work with will start understanding the schedule. When they get close to that 5, they behave faster. But right after they get reinforcement, they go a little slower because they're a little less motivated. The time between response 1, 2, and 3 might be kind of a long pause, and then they start responding faster up to that 5 where they're going to get their reinforcement. That's what the post-reinforcement pause means. Variable ratio is not fixed, so it's delivered after an average amount of responses, and this gets back to some of that math stuff. A VR, variable response ratio 4, is on average every 4 responses. If you average 2, 6, 4, you'll get 4. Add those together and divide by 3, you'll get 4. You have this schedule that you already made and you're going to deliver on these numbers. After 2 responses, they get reinforcement. After 6 responses, they get reinforcement. After 4 responses, they get reinforcement. And then maybe you recycle that or you come up with another 3 numbers. And so that would be a VR4. It's not every single fourth response. It's variable, but it's on average every fourth response. What this creates, because they don't actually know when the reinforcement is coming, because it's variable, it becomes a very high and steady rate with little to no pause. These variable ratio schedules, or variable any type of schedule, we'll talk about the other two, are really it's hard to extinguish these because they never know when their reinforcement is coming, so they just keep engaging in behavior. They're kind of, if you're fading, they're the stronger schedules to fade to, because what will happen is when you leave and there's no more reinforcement, you have a higher likelihood of the behavior continuing. So they're these very, very resistant to extinction schedules. But on the other hand, if you find this is how the environment is naturally responding to the behavior you don't want, extinction's going to be really hard. If it's like, oh, they've every two tantrums, they got attention from mom, and then she ignores them for a bit, and then the sixth tantrum, they get attention. And then she ignores them for a little bit, and then the fourth tantrum. That's going to be really hard to extinguish that behavior, because this whole thing is they never know when their attention's going to come. They just know if they tantrum enough, eventually they get attention. So they're going to just keep tantruming. In real life, these are what slot machines are on. This is why it's so addictive gambling, because they're using a variable ratio schedule. And so it's hard to extinguish. Someone doesn't win forever and ever, but they still engage in the behavior of paying money, pulling the slot handle down, because it's hard to extinguish the behavior. Even though they don't get reinforcement of winning something on the slot machine for so long, they still engage in that behavior. Gambling companies understand this almost better than us, and they are purposely utilizing this so that they can make the most amount of money off people. Okay, so now we have fixed interval, variable interval, which are very similar. The fixed and the variable part are the same, but the interval is not. Interval means time. This is a fixed time schedule. The words are interval and ratio, but in your head, you need to go from ratio to response and interval to time. Reinforcement is delivered for the first response after a fixed period of time. It doesn't matter how many times they respond within that fixed period. It can be none or 20. They still get the reinforcement after that fixed period of time. So an FI 30 is the first response after it should be FI 30 seconds, because you could do minutes too. But FI 30 seconds, first response after 30 seconds. So 30 seconds has to elapse before they are eligible for reinforcement. Their first response after that 30 seconds, which could be a minute, could be 2 minutes, that doesn't matter. They get reinforcement. What this creates is a scallop slow responding and then a burst at the end, so that they learn it, they get what's going on, and they'll kind of not respond in the first 20 seconds. And then that last 10 seconds, a little bit, they'll respond a lot until they get their reinforcement. So it does similar to the fixed ratio in that way. Checking the oven as the timer approaches is a real world example. So you have muffins, right? And baked muffins is your reinforcement. That's what you're accessing or trying to get. And how to get that is check the oven and make sure they're very cooked well. So, say it takes 30 minutes to cook them. With the first 20 minutes, you're probably not going to go look at them much. But then when you get closer to that 30-minute, you're going to look more often, because you know that the time's almost elapsed when your reinforcement is available. Okay, so variable interval is reinforcement delivered for the first response after a variable amount of time. And this is typically, again, variable and then interval. This is the most complicated one. So VI 20 seconds, on average after 20 seconds. It might be 10 seconds, then 5 seconds, then 25 seconds. If you average those all, they should be 20 seconds. So it's a very variable schedule, but on average, it should be 20 seconds. What this does is steady, moderate response rate. So you get the steady, moderate response rate, very resistant to extinction, this one. They don't know when the reinforcement is coming, constantly changing. It's not based on responses at all. It's based on a time element that they don't know. Checking your email at random, getting an email is your reinforcement. When that email is going to come, if you look at someone's email at a work site, most likely there's some sort of average going on. This person receives email on average every 20 minutes or so, but it could be they get one within the first 5 minutes of work, and then 10 minutes later, and then 20, and then 30, and then 5 again. It's on average. It's not a perfect schedule. And so because that exists, we check our email all the time. So we'll be very steady in our email checking, because you don't know if it's going to come in the next 5 minutes or 20 minutes, but it's not occurring all day long. So this is an example of that. Okay, so let's talk. I have multiple slides of examples here. So fixed ratio, let's talk about some examples. A punch card is a fixed ratio. You buy 10 copies and you get one free. And if you think about responses, when we're at the very beginning of our punch card, we might work on it kind of slowly. But when we get towards the end, we're going all the time to get that free copy. So worker paid after 100 envelopes stuffed. And you can see people will slow down in the beginning and get faster at the end because they're about to get their pay and they know that. Sticker chart, after all the token economies are a fixed ratio. Gym reps 10 squats before taking a rest. Even though this sometimes goes the opposite way because you're tired at the end, if you're not tired, you might do the squat slow and then you start speeding up so you can get that rest. VR slot machines are all VR, most of them. Some I've heard are based on time. People have done research on this. Actually, some are based on time, but most are on a ratio schedule. It's a random number of lever pulls, but the company has set up an average. I don't know what it is, 1,000. I have no idea how often that happens. I do not gamble, but let's say 1,000. So it's on an average of 1,000, but you might have to do 2,000 to get that win. You just don't know when it's going to happen, but it could be one. It literally could be one. So that's what makes it so exciting and addictive for people. Lottery, reinforcement winning, any kind of lottery is typically on a variable. Door-to-door sales. So this one's also, sales will happen on an average number of knocks. Like if sales never happen, nobody would ever engage in this. Like ever. Nobody would do this. Or the companies wouldn't pay for people to do door knocking. Like the company knows it happens on an average. So, but the more doors you knocked on, the more likely you are to get it. So telemarketing success is the same as when you're making calls, getting success. Okay, so fixed interval schedule. So weekly paychecks are fixed interval. So most of them, it kind of depends on your job, but most like pay on Friday, regardless of how much work is done. It doesn't matter how much you do, you're going to get paid when you're on. This is only for like employees on a salary typically. I mean, you could get fired if you don't do the work, right? So that's a whole different contingencies. This is just your paycheck. Scheduling exams. Test occurs every 4 weeks. That's one for a fixed interval. Baking timer, the food ready. And then medication reminders. Take a pill every 12 hours. Once the timer goes off, you take a pill. Anything on timers are typically that way. Okay, variable is checking email. You don't know when the new messages will arrive, but they're typically on some sort of average schedule. On average, you're going to get this many emails on a time schedule throughout the day. Same with boss checking in, unless they're specifically checking in every 10 minutes in general. It's going to be on praise you for being tasked at any moment. Fishing is a variable schedule. That's why people will sit for hours and hours to catch a fish. Pop quizzes would be on a variable interval schedule as well. So here's our schedule. FR is responses. It's fixed. High rate, post pause. There's that little pause because when you get close to that reinforcement, VR is based on responses, but it's variable. It's not consistent. It's on some sort of average. Very high and steady. Fixed interval is based on time. It's fixed and it produces a scallop. At the beginning of the time interval, you respond less, and the closer you get to the end of the time interval, you respond more. Variable interval is a time schedule. They have no idea when it's coming. It's very steady and moderate. So you can see variable, where the line is, that's when people respond. Variable ratio creates a straight up responding. Same with fixed ratio with a little post-reinforcement pause. Variable interval produces this kind of a little bit slower, but still really steady. And then fixed interval is a little bit slower, but the scalloped response. So you can kind of see how that works. Okay, so classroom examples, the student earns break every 5 math problems would be a fixed ratio. A fixed ratio schedule is where the student earns a break after completing a set amount of math problems, such as 5. A variable ratio schedule where the student earns a token after an average of 3 correct responses with the actual number variable varying. Praise after 10 minutes of on-task behavior is a fixed interval schedule. So every 10 minutes, if they were engaging in on-task behavior, they would receive praise at the end. Token delivered after unpredictable time intervals of attending would be a VR in classroom. I have more examples. Fixed ratio, we have the set amount of responses. A child gets a sticker for every 3 math problems completed, FR3. Factory workers played for every 10 items assembled, FR10. A student gets to play a game after writing 5 sentences, FR5. A dog gets a treat after performing 4 tricks, FR4. A token is earned after every 2 correct answers, FR2. A loyalty card is given after 10 coffee purchases, so you get a free coffee. Fixed interval reinforcement is delivered after a set amount of time, as long as the behavior occurs. The first response after the set of time, that's the same for the other interval schedule. First response after a set of time. So a student gets a break for working quietly for 10 minutes. A rat is reinforced for the first lever press after every 30 seconds. A teacher checks and praises on-task behavior every 5 minutes, so they look at them and praise them if they're engaging in it, but then they're not looking for the 10 minutes. A paycheck is delivered every 2 weeks regardless of output. A timer rings every 15 minutes, and the students who are on task gets points. A therapist delivers praise for the first time a client responds after a 1-minute interval. Variable ratio, so it's based on responses, but it's variable. Slot machines again. A teacher gives a reward after an average of 4 completed math problems. So 4, then 10, then 6. A fundraiser caller gets a bonus on an average of 5 pledges. So around 5 pledges would vary a little bit. A dog is given a treat on the average of 3 times sitting on command. Again, it's variable, but on average 3. An online game gives a reward after an unpredictable amount of wins. So that would be VR, but it's unpredictable. We would never utilize that schedule, but you could use it to describe behavior. A coach praises players after a variable number of successful passes. VRI or VI. Reinforcement is delivered after the first response, but a vary amount of time. So it's on average. A student receives praise for raising their hands, but only every few minutes. So it's like an average the teacher is using. An email arrives at unpredictable times, but checking inbox would be reinforced. A teacher delivers tokens for on-task behavior after 3, then 6, then 4 minutes. A customer service rep gets calls at unpredictable intervals, but reinforces like checking if the phone's ringing. A manager provides feedback at varying times throughout the day, and a behavior analyst reinforces compliance after an unpredictable delay. So why does this all matter? It shapes and maintains behavioral patterns. So understanding reinforcement schedules will help shape and maintain desired behaviors. Applying the right schedule can build persistence in reaching our goals. It reduces prompt dependency. So schedules can help reduce reliance on prompts or cues, and then it prevents our extinction burst. Knowing how schedules affect behavior can help us with that performance.